I've always been very nostalgic. I've always really loved sifting through old photos and rummaging through boxes of old things, hoping, maybe I'd find something that made a weird sound or an interesting sound that I could use at the drum set, and creating sentimental attachments to old photos and old objects, and I find those things really beautiful and universal in a way. But it was really finding these old photos of my mom at her second or third birthday party that brought out a lot of the emotions and ideas and memories that would eventually transform into the music of this project. Not only did those photos become the album artwork, but I actually printed them out and taped them up around the studio because I wanted this feeling of nostalgia to really be present while we were making the music. I started writing this music after my mom passed away. So for me, the music and the entire process of putting this record together has become very deeply intertwined with my own healing process. I was in the middle of a jazz degree at the time. It was also around that time that I started to realize that I really wanted to, and I really needed to, share music as a composer and not just as a drummer. I wanted to make my own music. And so in a sense, the healing process and the process of finding my artistic voice and finding a direction for this first album became the same process. As a drummer, most of the work that I do is as a side person. So the really beautiful thing about that is I've been exposed to and I've had the chance to experience so many different traditions and scenes and musical worlds and people. And now I really get to bring all of these different experiences together. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to name the record, and this phrase, nostalgia and other fantasies, is something that I actually came up with really early on in the songwriting process, and it just sort of stuck, and I didn't feel like anything else that I could think of felt as meaningful or as moving as this idea. And not only that, but in a lot of ways it gives context and it shapes the way that the rest of the music is understood. And it definitely shaped the way that I wrote and put together the album. As I was writing the music, I kept thinking through this idea that our relationship with the past and with memory, on one hand, is this really nurturing, identity-giving thing, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily something that's truthful. These ideas we have about the past are not necessarily ideas that can move us forward in a positive way. So that duality of what that means to look backwards, to me that was at the core of what this album was about. Some of the song titles on the album come from very specific moments and for me have very particular feelings of nostalgia and a place and a time. A Ballad for an Old Barn, for example, when I was on tour in Willowbunch, Saskatchewan, which is the name of one of the other songs, I was performing at a folk festival on a farm, and the owners were tearing down this barn that was decades, if not centuries old. And I remember helping them tear down the barn into these beautiful, strong pieces of lumber that they were planning on repurposing for some other project. And it got me thinking that being there in this exact moment when the barn was transforming into the next stage of its life was such a special moment because it was a perfect example of change over time in the most positive and beautiful way. There's other songs like Memories and Anchor that are not about specific moments, but more about what it means to think about the past and what that relationship means to our future. So for a song like Memories and Anchor at the time, I was exploring the idea that memory on one hand is this really grounding force and it can keep you from floating away in a sense, can keep you grounded with your own identity. But on the other hand, it's something that can keep you stagnant and something that can keep you from moving forward. As a drummer, I'm very often thinking in terms of texture and sound and color. So for me, the decision of instrumentation in the group as I was writing the music became a very obvious and a very natural way to extend that drummer mentality into a mentality as a leader and as a composer. This band has been working together now for about a year, but we've all known each other a lot longer than that. So going into this project, we already had this sense of not just musical trust, but more importantly, a real friendship. And just growing that was in a lot of ways as important or even more important than just getting the music together, because it's that trust that creates the environment where each of the players can bring themselves into the music and bring their own layers of creative and emotional complexity and artistry. So I wrote the music with a lot of elements that were very, very specific, but I also wrote it to be very free and interactive a lot of the time, because I know that as a band, we're able to tell the story of each song better if everyone is telling it from their own perspective. Caitlin Smith plays viola on the record, and there's just such a beautiful, warm richness to that instrument and the way that she plays it. And there's almost something humble about the viola. It's not very often given the opportunity to take a leadership role in an ensemble, but in the case of this music, everyone has to take a leadership role. So for me, it's really a special experience to get to hear the viola at the forefront of the music. And Caitlin, she's willing to improvise and take the viola into spaces and sounds that are a little unusual for that instrument. And I think that that's really special. Matt McConnell plays bass on the record. He's just such an amazing person to have on my team. It's just amazing how well he serves the music and how much he dedicates of himself just to make the music as good as possible and to make the people around him able to play the music as well and as honestly as they can. I feel like every time I talk to him about music or play with him, I just come out a little more mature as a player and as a composer and as a person. He's really just such a positive force, and I'm really happy that he's around. I knew very early on, as I was writing the music, that the two guitar players that I wanted for the project would be Zach Bachand and Marcus Lowry. On top of being such great improvisers and on top of being so comfortable on both electric and acoustic instruments, they both have such a deep love and a deep knowledge of these North American folk traditions that I'm drawing inspiration from for this music. And Zach and I actually spent the last few summers touring Central Canada, playing in some folk festivals. So for me, it was an obvious choice, and I knew I wanted him in the project right away. And Marcus is someone whose playing I've just always admired. And I love his approach to improvised music because it's so full of heart and it's so full of love. And he's so appreciative of so many different musical traditions that when he plays, that love and that beauty is present. So it's just such a joyful thing to hear him play and to have him in the band. I think at the end of the day, this music and this project only exist if the right people can play it and bring it to life and appreciate what I'm trying to do and bring it to a point where it's a lot greater than the notes on the page. And I'm really looking forward to the future projects and seeing where this whole energy takes us. When we think about nostalgia, we think almost exclusively about the past. But it's only through moving forward towards a future that we can look backwards. And I feel like that's where the idea of fantasy enters. Because, of course, nostalgia can be just a fantasy. But at the end of the day, fantasy is looking forward. And it's what moves us towards an ideal to strive for. And I find that beautifully optimistic, that despite all of this time I've spent looking backwards, ultimately the music of this record only gives me the privilege of looking backwards because of how it pushes me towards the future.